"Show me your ID, old man, or get out." The pharmacist's voice sliced through the quiet hum of the small-town pharmacy, sharp and cold as a winter wind. The words hung in the air, heavy with disdain as the fluorescent lights flickered above the counter. The young man behind the register, barely out of his 20s, leaned forward, his name tag glinting Kyle in cheap plastic. His eyes narrowed, lips curling into a smirk that screamed entitlement. The pharmacy was tucked into a strip mall on the edge of Millersville, Tennessee, a place where the scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint sweetness of cough drops. Shelves were stacked with over-the-counter remedies, their bright packaging a stark contrast to the faded linoleum floor. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the glass storefront, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A few customers lingered near the aisles, two women debating cold medicine, an elderly man flipping through a magazine, but all froze when Kyle's voice boomed. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft whir of the air conditioner. Elijah Carter, the man at the counter, stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping a small paper bag containing a single bottle of flea medicine for his aging service dog, Rusty. At 72, Elijah was a towering figure despite his slight stoop, his silver hair cropped close, his face etched with lines that told of decades spent under fire in Vietnam and Iraq. His faded denim jacket bore a single patch, a Bronze Star medal replica pinned above his heart. In his left hand he clutched a prescription slip, creased from being folded and unfolded a dozen times. His dark eyes, usually warm with quiet humor, now flickered with a mix of shock and hurt, the sting of Kyle's words sinking deep. Elijah's chest tightened, not from his old shrapnel wound, but from the weight of being reduced to old man in a place he'd visited every month for years. He'd driven 20 miles to this pharmacy, the only one in the county that stocked Rusty's medication. Rusty, a loyal German shepherd who'd saved Elijah from more than just enemy fire, was waiting in the truck outside, his graying muzzle resting on the dashboard. The thought of Rusty's trusting eyes made Elijah swallow hard, his voice steady but low when he finally spoke. "I've got the prescription right here," he said, sliding the slip across the counter. "Same one I've brought every month. Never needed ID before." His tone was calm, almost pleading, but there was steel beneath it, a soldier's resolve that hadn't faded with age. Kyle didn't even glance at the paper. He crossed his arms, his smirk widening. "Policy's changed. No ID, no meds. You deaf or just slow?" A snicker escaped him, and one of the women in the aisle stifled a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. The elderly man by the magazines shook his head, muttering something under his breath, but no one stepped forward. The air grew thick with tension, the kind that made your skin prickle. Elijah's fingers twitched, brushing against the dog tags tucked beneath his shirt, a habit from years of grounding himself in chaos. The tags were worn smooth, engraved with the name of his best friend, Marcus, who hadn't made it back from Saigon. In that moment, Elijah felt Marcus's absence keenly, a hollow ache that mingled with the humiliation burning in his gut. He'd faced mortars, ambushes, and worse, but this, a kid half his age dismissing him like trash, cut deeper than any blade. "I'm a veteran," Elijah said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Served 2 tours. This is for my service dog. He needs it." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a worn VA card, its edges frayed from years in his wallet. The card trembled slightly in his hand, betraying the anger he was fighting to contain. Kyle barely glanced at it. "Doesn't matter. Rules are rules. No driver's license, no refill. Move along. You're holding up the line." There was no line, just the 2 women and the old man, now watching with a mix of pity and unease. Kyle's tone dripped with mockery, and he gestured toward the door like he was shooing a stray dog. Elijah's jaw clenched, his mind racing. He didn't have his driver's license, hadn't needed it since his neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, started driving him to appointments after his vision began to blur. The VA card was all he carried, proof of a life spent serving a country that now seemed to spit in his face. He thought of Rusty, the way the dog's tail still wagged despite the pain in his joints, and Elijah's resolve hardened. He wasn't leaving without that medicine. "Call your manager," Elijah said, his voice steady now, each word deliberate. He planted his feet, his broad shoulders squaring as if preparing for a fight. The pharmacy felt smaller, the walls closing in, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder in his ears. The scent of antiseptic stung his nose, and the weight of every eye in the room pressed against him. Kyle rolled his eyes, scoffing. "Manager's out. I'm in charge, and I say you're done here." He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a taunting hiss. "Don't make me call security, Grandpa." The word Grandpa landed like a slap, and Elijah's breath caught. He saw his granddaughter Lily in his mind, her gap-toothed grin when he'd taught her to fish last summer. He'd promised to take her again this weekend if Rusty was well enough. The thought of letting her down, of failing Rusty, made his hands ball into fists, the paper bag crinkling in his grip. One of the women in the aisle finally spoke, her voice tentative. "He's just trying to get medicine for his dog. Can't you help him?" Her companion nodded, but Kyle shot them a glare, silencing them. The elderly man by the magazines shuffled forward, his cane tapping the floor, but hesitated, his eyes darting between Elijah and Kyle. Elijah felt the weight of their gazes, a mix of sympathy and cowardice that made his stomach churn. He was alone in this, just like he'd been in the jungle, the desert, the nightmares that still woke him at 3 a.m. But then, a sound cut through the tension, a low, insistent bark from outside. Rusty, sensing his master's distress, was pressing his nose against the truck's window. His ears perked. Elijah's heart swelled, a spark of defiance igniting. He wasn't just fighting for medicine, he was fighting for dignity, for the promises he'd kept to his country, his dog, his family. He leaned forward, his voice low and commanding, the kind that had once rallied men in battle. "Son, you're making a mistake. I'm not leaving without that medicine." Kyle's smirk faltered for a split second, but he doubled down, grabbing the phone from the counter. "Fine. Security it is." As he dialed, the pharmacy door swung open with a jingle, and a gust of warm air swept in, carrying the faint scent of diesel. Heads turned and Elijah's pulse quickened, though he didn't know why. Something was coming. Something that would change everything. We've only just begun this story, but trust me, it's about to get even more intense. Stay with it to find out what happens when Elijah faces even greater injustice. The pharmacy door's jingle faded, replaced by the heavy thud of boots on linoleum. A security guard, broad-shouldered and wearing a too-tight uniform, stormed in, his radio crackling with static. His name tag read Dwayne, and his scowl matched the one Kyle, the pharmacist, still wore behind the counter. The air in the Millersville pharmacy grew thicker, charged with the kind of tension that makes your heart pound in your ears. The fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly, casting harsh shadows on the shelves of cold remedies and the small crowd now frozen in place. Two women clutching their shopping baskets, an elderly man gripping his cane, and Elijah Carter standing tall despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. Elijah's dark eyes flicked to the guard, then back to Kyle, who leaned back with a smug grin, arms crossed like he'd already won. Elijah's hand tightened around the crumpled paper bag in his grip, the flea medicine for his service dog Rusty, still unpaid for. The prescription slip lay on the counter, ignored next to his VA card, a symbol of his 2 tours in Vietnam and Iraq, now reduced to a useless piece of plastic. The faint bark of Rusty from the truck outside pierced the silence, a reminder of why Elijah couldn't back down. His chest ached, not just from the old shrapnel scar, but from the raw sting of being dismissed, mocked, and now threatened in a place he'd trusted for years. Dwayne loomed closer, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "Sir, you need to leave. Now!" His voice was gruff, practiced, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes as he took in Elijah's weathered face and the bronze star patch on his denim jacket. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the women whispering to each other, their voices barely audible over the air conditioner's hum. The elderly man by the magazines coughed, his cane tapping nervously, but no one spoke up. The injustice hung heavy, like the sour smell of antiseptic that clung to the air. "I'm not causing trouble," Elijah said, his voice low and steady, the kind that had once calmed soldiers under fire. "I just need my dog's medicine. I've got the prescription, the VA card. I've been coming here for years." He pointed to the slip on the counter, his finger steady despite the tremor in his heart. The dog tags under his shirt pressed against his skin, a cold reminder of his friend Marcus, who died in his arms in Saigon. That memory fueled him, kept his spine straight. He wasn't just fighting for Rusty, he was fighting for every sacrifice he'd made, every promise he'd kept. Kyle scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You heard the man. Out! You're holding up my customers." He gestured to the empty space behind Elijah, his tone dripping with mockery. The women in the aisle exchanged glances, one clutching her basket tighter, her lips parting as if to speak. But she hesitated. The elderly man muttered something about disrespect, but his voice was too soft to carry. The crowd's silence was a knife in Elijah's gut, twisting deeper with every second. Dwayne stepped closer, his shadow falling over Elijah. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, old-timer." The word old-timer landed like a jab, and Elijah's jaw clenched. He saw his granddaughter Lily's face in his mind, her bright eyes when he'd promised to take her fishing this weekend if Rusty was well enough. Failing Rusty was not an option. But the guard's hand on the baton and Kyle's smug grin told him this wasn't just about medicine anymore. It was about power, about a system that let kids like Kyle and guards like Dwayne treat men like Elijah as less than human. "I'm not leaving without that medicine," Elijah said, his voice rising, each word a hammer striking steel. He planted his feet wider, his broad shoulders squaring, the soldier in him waking up. The pharmacy felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the antiseptic smell sharper, the buzz of the lights louder. His heart raced, but not from fear, from a fire kindling deep inside, born of decades of facing down worse than this. He thought of Marcus, of the promises they'd made to each other in the jungle, and his hand brushed the dog tags again, grounding him. Dwayne's hand tightened on the baton, his eyes narrowing. "You're testing my patience, sir. Move, or I'll move you!" The threat was real, and the crowd felt it. One of the women gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while the other whispered, "This isn't right." The elderly man finally spoke up, his voice shaky but clear. "He's a veteran, for God's sake. Let him get his dog's medicine." The words hung in the air, a small spark of defiance, but Kyle shot the man a glare, silencing him. Elijah's gaze locked on Dwayne's, unflinching. "You ever serve?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Dwayne blinked, caught off guard, and for a moment his tough guy facade wavered. Elijah pressed on, his words slow and deliberate. "You know what it's like to fight for something bigger than yourself? To carry your buddy through hell knowing you might not make it? That dog out there?" He pointed toward the truck, where Rusty's barks grew louder, more desperate. "He's my buddy, and I'm not letting him down because of some power trip." The room went still, the weight of Elijah's words sinking in. The women's eyes widened, and the elderly man nodded, his cane tapping once, firmly as if in agreement. Even Dwayne hesitated, his hand loosening on the baton. But Kyle, undeterred, slammed his fist on the counter, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Enough of this sob story. Get him out, Dwayne, or I'm calling the cops!" The threat of police sent a chill through the room. Elijah's mind flashed to stories he'd heard. Veterans hassled, arrested, disrespected for no reason other than their age or their past. His heart pounded, not from fear but from the injustice of it all. He'd survived wars, rebuilt his life, raised a family, only to be treated like a criminal in his own town. The dog tags felt heavier now, a reminder of what he'd fought for, what he was still fighting for. Suddenly, a new sound broke the tension, a sharp, rhythmic tapping from outside, like boots marching in unison. The pharmacy door swung open again, and a gust of warm air swept in, carrying the faint scent of diesel and something else, something sharp and commanding. Heads turned, and Elijah's pulse quickened. The crowd parted, their whispers rising, as a figure stepped into the light, their silhouette framed against the setting sun. Whoever this was, they carried an authority that made even Kyle's smirk falter. "We're on the edge of the climax now. What happens next will turn everything upside down. You don't want to miss how Elijah's fight unfolds." The pharmacy door slammed open, the jingle of the bell drowned out by the sharp clack of polished boots against the linoleum. A woman strode in, her presence commanding the room like a general entering a battlefield. She wore a crisp white coat over a military-style uniform, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes, piercing and unyielding, locked onto the scene. The name tag on her coat read Dr. Abigail Reynolds, Maryland, Colonel. Ret. The air in the Millersville pharmacy shifted, the antiseptic sting now mingling with the faint scent of her leather satchel and the diesel lingering from outside. The crowd, two women clutching their baskets, an elderly man with his cane, and the stunned security guard, Dwayne, froze as her gaze swept over them. Kyle, the smug pharmacist, straightened behind the counter, his smirk vanishing like smoke in a storm. Elijah Carter stood rooted, his weathered hand still gripping the crumpled paper bag with Rusty's flea medicine. His VA card and prescription slip lay abandoned on the counter, symbols of a fight he'd been waging for what felt like hours. His chest heaved, the ache of his old shrapnel wound pulsing under the weight of humiliation, but his eyes burned with a soldier's defiance. Rusty's desperate barks echoed from the truck outside, each one a stab to Elijah's heart. He'd faced mortars and ambushes, but this, being belittled, threatened, and dismissed for trying to care for his service dog, cut deeper than any wound. The dog tags beneath his shirt, etched with his fallen friend Marcus's name, pressed cold against his skin, grounding him in the fire of his resolve. "Doctor." Reynolds' boots stopped inches from the counter, her shadow falling over Kyle. "What's going on here?" Her voice was steel-wrapped in velvet, calm but carrying the weight of authority honed over decades in military hospitals. The crowd held its breath, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder in the silence. Dwayne, the security guard, shifted uncomfortably, his hand dropping from his baton. The women in the aisle whispered, one nudging the other, while the elderly man with the cane leaned forward, his eyes bright with anticipation. Kyle stammered, his confidence crumbling. This guy won't show proper ID." I told him no ID, no prescription. "Policy." He gestured at Elijah, his voice thinner now, lacking the bravado he'd wielded moments ago. "Doctor." Reynolds' gaze flicked to Elijah, taking in his bronze star patch, the worn VA card, and the prescription slip. Her lips tightened, and she turned back to Kyle, her eyes narrowing. "Policy?" she repeated, her tone dripping with icy disdain. "You're denying a veteran his service dog's medication over a driver's license he doesn't need?" You think that card, she pointed to the VA card, her finger steady as a sniper's aim, means nothing? Elijah's heart thudded, a mix of relief and wariness. He didn't know this woman, but her presence felt like a lifeline. He stood taller, his shoulders squaring, though his hands trembled slightly, the paper bag crinkling. He thought of Marcus, of the promises they'd made in the jungle to always have each other's backs. Rusty was his family now, and this fight was for him. But the crowd's silence still stung until now. The elderly man with the cane stepped forward, his voice cracking but firm. He's right, you know. That man's a hero. You ought to be ashamed, the crowd murmured, a ripple of agreement spreading. One of the women nodded, her voice soft but clear. Give him the medicine. It's the right thing. Kyle's face reddened, his eyes darting between Dr. Reynolds and the crowd. I'm just following rules, he snapped, but his voice wavered. Dwayne took a step back, his hands raised as if to distance himself from the mess. Doctor! Reynolds leaned forward, her hands on the counter, her voice low and cutting. Son, I've treated soldiers in war zones, patched up men like him. She nodded at Elijah, who carried their brothers through hell. You don't get to disrespect that sacrifice because of some clipboard rule. She pulled a phone from her satchel, her fingers moving with precision. I'm calling the regional manager and the VA office. You'll be explaining this to them. The crowd gasped, the tension spiking. Elijah's breath caught, his mind flashing to Lily, his granddaughter, and the fishing trip he'd promised her. He saw her smile, her trust in him, and his resolve hardened. He stepped forward, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a lifetime of battles. This isn't about me, he said, his eyes locked on Kyle. It's about my dog. Rusty saved me more times than I can count. I owe him this. His hand brushed the dog tags, and for a moment he was back in Vietnam, Marcus's laughter echoing in his ears. The memory gave him strength, a quiet fire that burned through the shame. Doctor? Reynolds nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at Elijah. You're damn right you do, she said, her voice almost a whisper. She turned back to Kyle, her tone sharp again. Fill the prescription. Now. It wasn't a request. It was an order, the kind that had once rallied medics under fire. Kyle fumbled with the computer, his hands shaking as he processed the prescription. The crowd watched, their murmurs growing louder, a mix of awe and indignation. The elderly man banged his cane on the floor, a single resounding thump that echoed like a gavel. That's right, he called, and the women clapped, their baskets forgotten. The tide had turned, and Elijah felt it. A shift, like the moment a battlefield falls silent before victory. Minutes later, Kyle slid the medicine across the counter, his eyes downcast. Here, he muttered, barely audible. Elijah took it, his fingers brushing the bottle, relief flooding him. But Dr. Reynolds wasn't done. She pulled a business card from her satchel and placed it on the counter, her voice clear and commanding. This pharmacy will be hearing from the VA about training on veteran respect. And you, she pointed at Kyle, owe this man an apology. Kyle's mouth opened, then closed, his face pale. I'm sorry, he stammered, the words forced but real. The crowd erupted in soft cheers, the women smiling, the elderly man nodding vigorously. Elijah met Dr. Reynolds' gaze, and she gave him a small, knowing nod, a soldier's respect, unspoken but profound. As Elijah turned to leave, the crowd parted, their eyes following him with something new, admiration. He stepped outside, the warm Tennessee air hitting his face, the scent of diesel fading. Rusty bounded from the truck, tail wagging, and Elijah knelt, pressing his forehead to the dog's, the medicine bottle clutched tight. The dog tags warmed against his skin, and for the first time that day he felt whole. Dr. Reynolds followed him out, pausing at the door. She raised her hand in a crisp salute, a gesture that spoke of shared battles and unbroken honor. Elijah returned it, his heart full. The crowd inside was still buzzing, their voices carrying through the glass, a chorus of justice restored. This is the climax you've been waiting for. Elijah's stand changed everything, and the ripple effects will stay with you long after the story ends.